Hillman 16 of the Gazette finds that a popular vote would force candidates to travel far more, visiting states all over the country rather than just a couple of battleground states. That drives up campaign expenses as a whole. Azar 16 of Forbes finds that in the status quo, travel is a huge expense consisting of 6 to 8% of a standard campaign budget, a number that only rises under a popular vote. Second, advertising expenses. Gordon 13 of Columbia University finds that a direct vote would force candidates to purchase far more ads outside of battleground states. That's why Gordon predicts that a direct vote would increase spending on advertising by 25%. However, this increased incentive to advertise will spiral out of control, further inflating the cost of campaigning. Channel 16 of the LA Times writes that although advertising barely has any effect on the behavior of voters, every candidate must spend at least as much on ads as their opponents for fear of losing by even a sliver of a percentage point. It's like an arms race. Third, a bigger operation. Taking day-to-day functions of a campaign from swing states to the national scene is an expensive proposition. Buick 16 of Times Magazine writes that candidates would be forced to raise substantially more money under a national popular vote in order to sustain the operation of more campaign offices in cities with high rents and engage in a wider-reaching national voter outreach program. Fourth, recounts. Spazowski 11 of the Me Center finds that because popular vote margins are closer than electoral college margins, recounts would be more prevalent under a popular vote. He furthers that under the NPV, any voting discrepancies in even a single county would necessitate a time-consuming and unbelievably expensive national recount. McBride 16 of UMich finds that a recount forces states to hire thousands of temporary workers in order to increase the interest of efficiency, leading to up to a $3 million fee per state. A national recount could easily lead to costs equaling or exceeding $150 million. All in all, an increasing cost of campaigning brings more money into presidential politics. The impacts are twofold. First, saving the center. Rock 16 of the Atlantic explains that under the current system, candidates meet their fundraising goals by appealing to deep-pocketed individuals on the far left and far right. Willis of the New York Times explains that rising campaign costs would force candidates beyond these traditional sources and push them to seek fundraising from other sources. This need for money forces candidates towards the center. UPenn's Fang 11 found that political donations are more likely to move candidates towards the center than they are to move them towards either end of the political spectrum, because that's where the money is. Shifting presidential candidates towards the center is important, because McGill University's Troy 08 explains that throughout American history, the only presidents that have been able to overcome gridlock and make serious change in American society were moderates who could facilitate compromise across the aisles. Breaking down the chains of gridlock is crucial, because Dashby 14 of the Commission for Political Reform explains that when parties are unable to compromise, the ability of the nation to address real issues such as economic downturns, foreign policy quagmires, and immigration reform is undercut. Second, stabilizing politics. Aguelo Page 16 of the Huffington Post writes that currently, displeasure with the political system has caused third parties to rapidly gain influence. Increasing the cost of elections and the necessity for fundraising stops this trend in its tracks. Ratcheting up the cost of campaigning for presidents reverses that trend. Hines 15 of the Odyssey explains that because they lack extensive party bases and connections with which to organize fundraising campaigns, which structurally precludes them from rising to budgetary challenges posed by a national election. Preventing third parties from gaining prevalence is crucial, as Maliki 15 of the University of Freeburg finds that additional relevant parties in government lead to less focused fiscal policies because additional sets of interests must be accommodated in order to form an electoral coalition. Maliki thus concludes that each additional relevant party in government increases debt by 8.4% of GDP. For these reasons, Malcolm and I affirm.
Is everyone ready? Event United negate the resolution. Our sole contention is the divided states of America. As the Pew Research Center explains in 2017, political polarization is at its worst point in decades, manifesting in a wide range of political consequences. Gridlock has impeded the efficacy of the government, creating counterproductive policy and degrading public trust. The executive office is one of the only lines of defense against small majorities that push unrepresented law through government. Rosenthal explains in 2016 that the Electoral College aims to produce a president that can moderate the extremist undertones in our government by building unified national coalitions. A popular vote would make this possible in two ways, and the first is by fragmenting the race. According to Balzo of the Washington Post in 2016, the winner-take-all system rules out the possibility that fringe candidacies garnering enough votes in any single state to make it onto the scoreboard. Without the college, there'd be no break on the number of viable candidates, resulting in fragmented races with dozens of micro-candidates. The fragmentation would embolden extremists. As Angela of the Journal of Public Choice explains in 2007, in order for fringe candidacies to be successful, candidates must effectively differentiate themselves in the homogeneous contest of moderates by adopting extreme positions. When most candidates split the vote because of their similarities, those on either far end of the spectrum could emerge with a plurality. The best example is Europe. In recent years, populism has thrived as a result of popular vote systems that disadvantage moderates and most recently thrust two extremists into France's election runoff. As the Taxpayer Freedom Association concludes, a president elected by only 35% of the vote would lack the legitimacy that comes with a sweeping electoral college victory and would pose a serious threat to the nation in their capacity to pass harmful policy. Second is by degrading national coalitions. As Posner of UChicago explained in 2016, the Electoral College requires a candidate to have trans-regional appeal. No region has enough electoral votes to elect a president, so candidates decline to campaign heavily in states and refocus their efforts on pulling voters across the aisle in a select number of swing states. This is important because, as McLean of the Hill notes in 2016, these states have higher voter turnouts, near equal party identification, similar racial and economic composition to the nation as a whole, and a greater proportion of independents than the national average, putting them in a unique position to represent a wide array of national interests. That's why Ross concludes in the 2011 analysis of nearly every major election in the past 3 decades that the Electoral College forces candidates to build broad-based coalitions that represent the moderate middle rather than ideological extremes. A national popular vote would change this. As Caldero of the Mississippi Law Journal explains in 2011, if the margin in even the safest of states matters for the outcome of an election, candidates would shift their strategy from persuading swing voters to energizing their existing party bases in an effort to drive up turnout where they are concentrated. Rigdon of the DC Bar Association contextualizes in 2007 that the marginal cost of acquiring an additional vote is significantly lower in candidates' strongholds, where they already have efficient organization and wide recognition. Candidates, knowing that it's easier to bring supporters to the polls than to convince someone on the other side, would blanket vote-rich secure states like Texas and California with get-out-the-vote efforts and demoderate their platforms to ferment with their ideological appeal. For these two reasons, a national popular vote would incite a wave of politically extreme presidents. This is critical, as Howard of Harvard University explains in 2005, the executive office has more than enough mechanisms at its disposal to suit the president's strategic interests, be it by executive order or otherwise. Even worse, presidential extremism spills over to the rest of the government and locked in existing polarization. Barber writes in 2012 that when abused, the presidential veto inhibits majority rule by guaranteeing that the median legislator has no chance of pushing policy, while extreme faction support is a necessity. Problematically, as The Atlantic concludes in 2014, moderates uniquely have the ability to see both sides of the issue and represent Americans on income inequality, race relations, criminal justice, and more, all without ignoring the interests of the entire half of the nation. The rise of extreme presidencies will lend itself to a new group of forgotten Americans every 4 years, and it's for this reason that Devesh and I are incredibly proud to be here.
Did I see this like playing card saying money leads to centrism?
You guys mind card?
Yeah. So wait, pause real quick.
Yeah.
What is PA, FA, and MA? Like it's talking about 3 different systems.
We can talk about it when we have it. She looked at Spain studies.
Yeah, just show me what those 3 things are, because it's talking about those 3 things.
Yeah. So this top paragraph in the abstract, she studies 3 kinds of things she's constantly on.
Okay, can I just look at this while you start?
Actually, not computer.
Oh, okay, then we will use a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Here we go. And yes.
Alright, everyone ready? If I want to buy a Ferrari, but I do not have enough money to buy that Ferrari, can I still buy that Ferrari?
No.
No. Why?
Great. So along the same lines, I'm like a third-party candidate, and I don't have the money to run. Can I successfully run?
Wait, you're talking about money in the system, not necessarily money to candidates, right?
No, I'm talking about money to candidates because we're talking about donations.
You're talking, sure. So when money goes to a candidate, the money also goes into the whole system, right?
Because they run for a
Because
party.
it's going
I
into
don't
like the
understand
whole
why that's
presidential
relevant.
election system, right? So basically, if we
Do
prove to
candidates
you,
receive donations or not?
sure they do.
Sure.
So
the
yeah.
money's going to
So
the candidate.
my question to you, I get your question, right? But my question to you is that if we turn and show you like more money going into the government or the system right now, even though it's saturated, it's a bad thing. Do we win like your whole argument?
Wait, so we're arguing that more money going into the system is a good thing. I guess
Sure.
if you say it's a bad thing, you win that it's a bad thing. But like that's not really. It's not
Okay.
really.
So is money
if you win the argument,
saturated?
you win the
Is money
argument.
saturated right now?
I'd say like not as much as it could be.
Not really.
Yeah, we're saying.
So more money could go in and still have a huge impact.
So we're not really talking about like money going into the system. I think you're conflating the two arguments a little bit. What we're simply talking about is money that the candidates need to garner in order to run under an election. And under the national popular vote, you need to garner more money.
That's fine. So okay, yeah. So should
Can
it?
I ask you a question?
Wait, can I ask a question because you just asked one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So what's going to be the biggest impact in this debate?
I was just about to ask. Great.
Okay.
Moderation probably.
Moderation and like best policies, right?
I'd say moderation is pretty good policy. So yeah, we agree on that?
Moderation is a policy. Like what directly
No.
impacts people?
I would say that moderate presidents lead to good policy. Would you agree that that's probably the biggest impact in the term?
Wait, I just want to make sure that like in the end, if we do show that the best impacts come from like these swing states, that's a good thing, right? Because if the swing states are representative of the
Hold
whole
on.
country.
Wait, you're saying the best impact. I'm trying to give you the best impact.
The most
Like-
important impact in this one.
Right, which I've given you, which is moderation, because moderation leads to goodness.
Okay, so what does moderation lead to? Like that's my question. What directly impacts the people from this debate?
Hold on. Are you running moderation case, right?
Yeah.
So like, is
That's
there?
fine. Okay, that's fine.
Is mo-
If you
so-
agree with that, that's fine. You have a question?
Wait. So just to clarify, moderation is going to be probably the biggest impact in today's round.
Sure. And like moderation leads to like representative policy, but I guess you're agreeing to that. So yeah, okay. You can have a question.
So under, like, let's just say right now. Actually, that's
Okay, so let's talk about more big money, right? So when candidates receive donations, what do those candidates have to do to those donors?
tender to their interests.
Okay, so isn't that a bad thing?
No.
Why?
What Fang explains is that she does like the holistic analysis. It explains to you that most of the money lies in the middle. Right now, in the status quo,
Okay.
money is being received
So
from the two.
if more
Can I answer
money-
your question?
Go ahead.
Money is being received from the opposite ends of the spectrum. But in general, the majority of the money lies in the middle, which is important because we tell you that these candidates will have to seek out
Okay,
new
then let's-
donors
yeah.
if you increase the cost.
So
of
let's go
election.
back to my question or my case,
That's
right?
fine.
The new candidate. Okay.
You're going to read it out. All set. Minute 22 left. Is everyone ready? Start now. Overall on their case, before I get into the specifics, they have a three-tiered burden of proof if they want you to run any offense off of their case. First, they need to explain specifically what policies are currently being compromised on as a result of the moderation brought about by the Electoral College. If they can't give you that specific concrete impact, then they're just like speculating. Like, if we're all going to speculate right now, I'm going to say there's not a lot of compromise right now, insofar as Trump is the president. We're seeing like a lot of radicalization going on right now. But B, they need to prove that this compromise will disappear on the national popular vote, and then you won't see it whatsoever, and there won't be any moderation anymore. But C, they need to explain the concrete benefits that these policies will have on people. That's like what they're saying in First Crossfire when they say we need to prove the best policies. They need to prove that the policies that are being passed right now are actually benefiting people. But secondly, they shoot themselves in the foot at the top of their case when they tell you that gridlock is the worst First, right now, Doherty 14 of Pew Research Center agrees with them and finds that polarization between Democrats and Republicans is at its highest point in history right now. The consequence of this is apparent as Blake 14 of the Washington Post finds that 75% of issues today are in complete gridlock and that most issues aren't even partisan issues. So at the end of the day, it's try or die for the app if you want to reduce gridlock. Let's go into their specific arguments. They have two of them. The first is that we're going to fragment the race by letting fringe candidates in first. Our Hines evidence from case completely disagrees with that by saying when you increase the cost of the race, you structurally exclude these third-party candidates that don't have the parties and fundraising bases that they need to get involved in this hugely expensive campaign where you need to have at least $300 million or $150 million on retainer in order to pay for a recount in the event that it happens. But also, secondly, the primary process checks this back, right? You're not going to have more than one Republican running in support. There is a primary, so there's really no risk. But also, I'd argue that it's unique because in the status quo, you see third parties on the rise. It's the page evidence from case. And the third thing I want to say here is that in general, they don't prove to you that right now this is being solved insofar as Page is true, which means at the very least they can't get any offense off of it. It's empirically denied. The only risk of solvency is in our world when you increase the cost. Let's go to their second argument, where they talk about how you degrade coalitions because you can suddenly you don't need to have trans-regional appeal. First, this is patently false. Insofar as the no population center is concentrated enough for candidates to just campaign there, you end up seeing that you have a more diverse campaign. You can look to the back with evidence from case, which has very clear analysis in saying that candidates are going to need to campaign across the entirety of the country on a national popular vote, which means, if anything, they're accommodating more interests. But secondly, not everyone's votes are included in the Electoral College. Colin of the Huffington Post writes that the Electoral College disenfranchises millions of U.S. citizens in national and overseas territories with no representation. However, Cal's of the London School of Economics 15 explains that a national popular vote would provide the impetus for including all U.S. residents in a federal vote because you'd have an overseen federal election that everyone votes in and more people would campaign in. That further drives up the cost of campaign and enfranchises more people. You're also enfranchising voters in safe states which don't matter right now. But then third, pandering to swing states is really, really bad. Abbott 91 of Brooklyn College writes that industrial workers, which are very populous in swing states, so parties pander to their desire to get votes. Industrial workers tend to desire trade protection because they want to keep their job, which according to UVA's Luwade 16, they are given by parties in exchange for votes. However, harming free trade harms every American citizen because Spadolini 09 of Rutgers University quantifies that every 1% decrease in trade restrictiveness of a given country increases per capita income in that country by 0.3%. Most concrete impact on the ground if they drop in its game over. But then, they're like, turnality of this second warrant is that parties are going to work to increase turnout instead of actually trying to moderate. But I'd say that that's good for two reasons. First, you compromise with, that concedes that you need to do these large-scale spending routines that increase turnout. That's our back without it, which means you need to compromise your beliefs in order to attract the donors that you need to motivate your party. But second, Steenkeist 14 of Stanford University writes that right now the people who are turning out when there's low turnout are the radicals, which means if they're trying to motivate party turnout, they are going to be appealing to their moderates and move towards the center. You're straight to against them. But overall, an additional impact to the app that turns their case comes from our Willis evidence, which tells us that more money brings in more interest groups, which leads to more cooperation. Bowman 10 of Texas A&M University finds that interest groups force states to work together, quantifying that a one standard deviation increase in interest group density leads to a 14% increase in interstate compacts.
Can I get this? Actually, no. I'm going to go also kind of fast, but I'll be clear. It's going to go down hard. Oh, that wasn't it. You were also clear. So, you're great. So anyways, I'm going to go down his three-pronged overview, then I'm going to go down our entire case, and then we'll go to their case. Everyone good? Cool, time starts now. The first thing to tell you is that the moderation is happening right now. He gives the example of Trump, but Trump is an anomaly because that was the only election where we had two candidates with net negative infavorability, which means that nobody would be willing to vote across the aisle, and as a result, they didn't go for swing voters. If you look at the last 30 years before the Ross analysis says that candidates empirically move to the middle, they say what policies is this represented in. They tell you that 75% of candidate policies have gridlock, that 25% that don't are good things, so we're getting rid of the 25% only vote for them. The second thing he tells you how is it going to disappear. That's our case. The third thing he tells you what are the concrete benefits. Well, we can see that moderation is the most important impact because long term, if you have gridlock, then you can't get any policies passed. He says that we shoot ourselves in the foot when we can see the polarization is an all-time high. No, we don't. But our argument is that polarization is at an all-time high, but that the president is the only check against existing polarization. If the veto is abused, then only extremists can push policy through Congress, which then locks in all the polarization that already exists in Congress, which means they link it to the entire impact. But then, Go to our first link about third-party candidates. We're not going for this link. There are two ways you can non-unique this link so we can kick out of it. The first is he says the primary checks back, which means, again, there's no probability of third parties winning. And second is we prove to you that in the status quo, third parties cannot win either way. So even if they are increasing, even if they decrease in their world, they wouldn't win either way. It doesn't really matter. Let's go to our second link, which is clearly what we're going for. The first thing he says is patently false because they're not concentrated enough in these areas. Two problems with this. First, NPR finds that when you account for the fact that most people who say they're independent actually being very hard left or very hard right, there's only about 6 to 7% of people in America who are really independent. These people are not going to swing the election. But then second, and more importantly, John Koza finds that when you account for all the people in the middle of America, they split politically 50-50, so candidates can safely ignore these people and only go for their bases to break the tie, which is where we get our link, because it's easier to convince someone who already supports you to vote for them than to change somebody else's mind. And the second thing he tells us that a lot of people are disenfranchised right now. Remember, voting is not the most important impact. Policy is the most important impact. We're in a federalist system where even if you don't vote, if you get represented, that's a good thing. The third thing he tells you is something about turnout, and then he also talks about how donors are going to be motivating policy change. The problem with this, right, is that if you're going for extremist bases, then your voters and your donors end up being extreme. Their analysis is more generalized, whereas we tell you that politicians are first going to decide what are the easiest votes to get, then they're going to decide who to pander to in terms of donors. And then the final thing he tells you is that low turnout leads to radicalization. The problem is the Hill tells us that when you focus on these swing states specifically, there is high turnout from independents. There are more independents in general. This might be true about the rest of the country, but that's just another reason to vote for us. Finally, he says that interest groups are good. The problem comes in Box in 2016, which finds that most of the interest groups that actually dominate the donation pool end up being people who want extreme positions, and more importantly, they end up giving interest to the rich instead of the average middle class. That's the argument that you've probably heard in every speech this debate, except for this case. Let's go to their case. They give you 4 links into money increasing. We agree, money increases. But I also want to turn their ads point just for fun. Lau in 2017, in a 183 study meta-analysis finds that an increase in ads leads to negativity in elections, which then decreases turnout of people in the middle because those people lose faith in the process and it only emboldens extremes even more, which links into polarization. Okay, now let's go to their impact. The first thing I can tell you is that they're going to be helping the moderate center. A few problems with this. First, is that this assumes the candidates would not go for rich donors first. But they've been making this argument for the last 20 years every time we pass a new deregulation of campaign finance, and every single time we've seen an exponential increase in campaign finance from rich people, because rich people have money to give and they will keep giving it, and politicians will continue to pander to those people. But then second and more importantly, I would contend that most donors actually end up being ideologically extreme. The candidates that get the most in-person donors end up being people like Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, who are farther to the left and the right and can aggravate their bases, and even more so, moderate candidates will start to do so to get more donors, which then again makes them more extreme. Then we would tell you that even if you get more individual donors, they're not going to have an impact on policy. The reason comes from the Brennan Center in 2016, which finds that one donation from a rich person is worth about 180,000 donations from an individual. You can't pander to that person. When you can pander to the rich person, you always choose to do so. They give you one card saying that it's going to be the opposite. First, don't buy a card if it's not backed up by a warrant. Second, their card looks at 3 different kinds of alternative campaign financing systems. None of them are the status quo. And most importantly, it says that the partial anonymity system actually increases polarization. That's PA in their study. And that's what we have right now. Because the anonymous donors get preference since they can do behind the door deals, which end up being the rich people. Finally, on the third party impact, again, they're not going to win either way. So I guess it doesn't matter. These are first time. Cool. Are you sure? Okay.
We're gonna keep going. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Polarization and decrease moderate they can see loud 27%, loud is 27%, and then plus even if they win or 50 plus, you can have way more than
40 seconds left.
Okay, you ready?
Yes.
Cool.
So let's start with that.
Yeah.
So you tell me on advertising
that
negativity will crowd out middle class, middle voters, moderate voters, right?
Kind of negative ads cause decreases in turnout, and those decreases in turnout
So
are
how do you
especially
determine
pronounced
what's
against moderate voters. Negative ads, like attack ads,
Okay, sure. So
and those are the most prominent kind of ads.
Yeah, that
That's
makes
what
sense.
he said.
That makes sense.
You can see it increase in ad spending. So
Yeah, no, I was just trying to understand the card.
Cool.
But so I guess
Can I have a question now?
brief follow up on that, if you don't mind, just because that's
yeah.
clarification, is that's just an impact that it has on voters, right?
Yeah.
Great. Do you have a question for me?
Wait, really quick.
Yeah.
You say that like individual people can have a voice on the platform of the candidate. Otherwise, their individual donations wouldn't matter. So if there are less votes by independents, more votes by extreme people, A, they're voting for extremists. B, they're not being represented by the candidates who aren't going to pay their votes.
Our case is not about contributions to campaigns by people. I think everyone should write that down.
What? Then what is it by?
Our case is about special interests and businesses of medium to large size.
Okay, so you are talking about special interests in businesses.
Yeah.
And you're telling me that the rise of campaign finance in the last 20 years has led to moderation.
I actually do want to talk about that.
Yeah.
How has campaign finance reform been enacted in the past couple of years? Like, what did Citizens United do?
It increased anonymous donations.
It released the cap on the amount that an individual or a corporation is allowed to contribute.
Yeah.
That is a different kind of reform than we are advocating.
You're saying there will be more donors into the pool.
We are saying that we are going to increase the amount of money that candidates need in order to be competitive.
I got
What that does is, with the Willis evidence, which you draw, it makes them appeal to more donors that are
Here's the
spread
problem.
across the ideological
Really quick. If you're already giving me $10 and I'm giving you a favor, why would I try to get another $10 from John when I could just ask 20 from you and give you 2 favors?
So sure, that might make sense. But if I were, for example, the Koch brothers, and I was giving you somewhere in the ballpark of $100 million,
yeah, they're willing to give a lot more than
me
that.
And you said, "Hey, can I have an extra $200 million?" I might say, "Ask someone else."
Well, if that's the case, then why after Citizens United, when we lifted the cap, did money exponentially increase?
Money.
Like you just said, that it's a different kind of reform,
right?
But money still
But
increased
here's the
because
thing.
that kind of reform incited the same people to give more money for more favors.
It's totally different. Because
No,
right now, what the
Yeah.
Willis evidence indicates
Yeah.
is that these big donors are giving like a lot of money. That's what Raj talks about.
Sure.
But what Willis says is that if you increase the amount of money that they need, they'll have to branch out.
I know what Willis says, and I'm saying what I say as a logical member of this debate, and I'm telling you that logically, if I can get more money from a person, I don't need a card to explain it for me, that person would more likely give me more money for more pork barrel projects rather than to reach out to
while
more
what you're
people.
saying may be intuitively true, it is false in the real world.
Okay, so give me a study that shows that. Like the Willis card is just analysis, it's not a study.
Wait, okay, so it like does some numbers, and I think it analyzes.
No, wait, it's like an article.
It has a graph. My question for you is, do you have a graph?
No, I don't. Game over. You can see. Okay. Over. Yeah. We don't actually concede. Okay. We're out of time. And they will just become more extreme by getting more favors.
All right. Start off on their second, like they say they're going to go for that self-trust and whatnot. They say they're going to decrease national coalitions. The problem is, and that's going to lead to moderation. The problem is the main moderation comes here when you see that they're going to be pandering to the interest of donors. Because when they pander to the interest of donors, that's going to be leading to the moderation. Remember, we're talking about the moderation of policy, not just getting moderate voters to vote. At that point, when you see that the policy of these candidates is going to be changing, which comes from the fewest evidence, you're going to be seeing that that's when their biggest impact is going to be made. But the main voting, like the main turn that you're going to be placing on the contention comes on trade, which they don't respond to. That's one of the responses that Malcolm places on. They only say that like candidates want easy votes. That's our point, because Abbott explains that in these populous industrial states, there are a lot of interest groups here, like industrial workers, and in order to pander to the needs of these industrial workers, then you're going to be looking to LaWanda, who explains that these candidates are going to be granting non-tariff barriers to these industrial workers in order to gain their vote, which is really bad because overall this quarter neo evidence that Malcolm gives you tells you that it decreases income by 0.3%. Again, a very, very, very concrete impact. They're talking about like nebulous policies or like nebulous people coming to vote and some impact coming out of there. But when we're telling you that the policies themselves are changing, that is a very clear way to vote for us. The second way to vote for us is on this point of financing being beneficial. Remember, we're not talking about like individual people who are like have somewhat wealthy donating. We're talking about these rich interest groups coming in and donating. At that point, we drop all of their responses that aren't relevant to interest groups. But the problem here is that he tells you that like we're going to be seeing like an increase in extremism, the evidence that comes from Boston. box. But overall, what Rock tells you is we're seeing this in the status quo, but we're seeing money coming from both sides. But that doesn't matter, because what Willis explains is that when you increase the price, which again they concede, when you increase the price of conducting campaign financing, like election, you're going to see that they have to turn to other donors. That's what Willis explains. And what Fang explains, and like their index to Fang doesn't make much sense, because Fang looks to a couple of different electoral systems, but it looks to an electoral college overall, and finds that overall, donation systems overall. It finds that on net, whatever system you look to, donations increase moderation. That's the key thing to take away from this study. Like, look to the general trend of the study. At that point, you're going to be seeing that the majority of the money lies in a place where moderation increases overall. At that point, look to Troy, who tells you moderate candidates are going to be very beneficial, and like since they agree moderation is big impact, and we're accessing it to that, you should weight that very heavily in today's round.
How much work do we have left? I didn't use any, and then we use like 50 on the card. So that 140.
Yes, yeah, 145.
Okay, cool. Start now. Start. Yeah, so we just need to read this. Yeah, I wrote that. Just be slow, run it. Yeah, just start with that. Then the only thing that I is that the only a marginal increase in business is not going to matter as much as a complete reconfiguration of vendors' capabilities, like in the magnitude of and extend that. That's the only thing that shows because they're going to two things. One, the donors and very slow. Explain it very slowly. Ingress. I don't need to touch it. Yeah. It's not changing. Okay, what is it? The load is voted while there's unchanged under the PA system. Yeah. Isn't it? No, okay.
Alright, what order is going to be our case, especially like the free trade thing they bring up, and then return on. Is everyone ready? Let's start with our case. The first response they talk about is about donations. Remember that one, we guarantee that moderation occurs in the status quo because it's happening right now. But second, remember that they're advocating for complete reconfiguration, which means that the magnitude of their negative harms is going to be a lot greater than the status quo. But then they talk about all these campaign finances. But remember they say that compromises mean more money is needed. But remember they care more about the moderates who vote for them first. The second one is to talk about more interest groups, forced cooperation. Remember, Blockson says that donations are mainly for extremists, and that's why it's going to be incentivizing everyone to be extremists to get the money in the first place. But then let's talk about this free trade thing. Remember, first the Harvard School of Health finds that in the status quo, 89% of the people support trade restrictions and protectionism in the U.S. This is a general non-new trend. Second, we have the Hill writes that the majority of swing voters want new trade deals and not no new trade deals. That means there's going to be no protectionism and solves or blip. The more extended, Lena Recchi says that swing states right now have the highest amount of turnout, identical party identification, and same racial and economic composition, which means that if we vote for the swing states and what they want, this would be representative of what the country wants, and that's moderation going back to our framework. But then remember, Ross says that candidates will have to pattern to the model of the swing states because right now the bases are equal. The only way for them to win the swing states is to be moderate, and Colorado tells you that in the national popular vote, the strategic thing for candidates to do is no longer to be moderate, but to make sure that they get a lot more turnout in their states, which is going to be a bad thing because they're moving away from moderatism, and that's going to be like the biggest impact, like they say. But then let's go on to their case. First, when they talk about ads, extend law that says that ads are going to be increasing polarization and decreasing turnout. Again, that's going to be decreasing or increasing polarization. But then when they talk about donations, remember that every donation goes to the rich and becomes special interest. That's going to be a bad thing. But second, remember that moderate
candidates will want to be more extreme so they can get the money. Again, that's going to be another turn on money. But third, remember that they will always be pandering to the rich, and they always want to get the richest money because, like, the rich is going to be the main donors for those people, and because the rich are usually people that support extreme views, they're going to be turning that as well because they're just going to be a lot more extreme. That's going to be increasing polarization. And that's going to be a decreased amount of moderation in the policy, which is again going to be the biggest impact.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Right?
Yeah.
So let's start. So, if the judges were to vote for you right now, what would their RFP be?
What would their RFP be?
Yeah.
I vote neg on Robert's attractiveness and on the argument about going for base voters.
Well, I can't respond to the first one.
Okay.
But, sorry, it's a good time. It's fine. In terms of base votes,
Yeah.
let's talk.
They could vote on other things too, but that's one of them. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm just trying to throw you off, bro.
yeah, this is sweet. Okay, so let's talk about base voters, right? So you tell me they're going to motivate their base. What part of their base?
The people who are like on the far left or right who already ideologically align with them.
Okay.
Like people who live, if you're like blue, probably people in cities. If you're red, people in the deep south.
So right now, who's showing up to the polls?
Like in the country as a whole, everybody, it could be hard blue, hard red, but they're in spectator states, so it doesn't make an impact. The people in the swing states tend to be independent, moderate, and the moderates actually turn out in higher numbers there, which is why it's great to candidate swing states.
Okay. You have a question for me?
Yeah, I do. So this donors argument, right? Let's say finance increases by, how much percent do you want? Give me a number.
17 trillion.
17 trillion. Okay, let's do something less than 17 trillion. 25%, or it could be more. But you have a card saying 25%, so I want to use that.
Wait, that's
right?
just for us.
Oh,
We
it
also,
says, okay.
we
whatever.
also have we also have the argument about recounts suggests that
You
you
didn't
need.
accept Okay, fine. The number doesn't matter.
because you agreed.
The number doesn't matter. That's fine.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so let's talk about. Let's say spending increases, right? If spending increases and candidates are already beholden to donors' interests, how much of a terminal impact on moderation does the diversification of those interests
There we go.
have?
This is beautiful. Because we agree. Candidates already get radical donors. Like people like the Coke donors, right? Because
Yeah.
that's the easy one.
Yeah.
They're already beholden to them.
Right, and
Yeah.
rough evidence suggests that as well.
Yeah.
Okay, but the
Once
only
again,
wait, so what I'm saying is that, like, in the status quo, the only reason those donors don't completely overhaul their policy is because they also have to be moderate to get swing state support.
Wait, but don't the donors overhaul their policy?
I got some issues, yeah.
Okay, cool. But we say what's different about our world is
Yeah.
Willis evidence, which says they have to expand, just like they have to expand their base of voters, they have to expand their base of donors
And
to
I'm
increase
saying-
the requisite cost.
And I'm
And that's
saying-
important because when you add other factional interests, like these other special interest groups that are going to be fighting them into the equation, their interests check each other back, and you yield a moderate candidate who wants to appeal to
Okay,
as much as
wait,
possible.
really quickly.
It's classic
A
federalism
bunch
if you
of
want
a
stuff.
bunch of special interests does not yield a moderate. It yields a person going for a bunch of special interests.
I could read you a really, really eloquently worded James Madison card from the 1700s.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's not.
Also, regardless though, like we would say like money is probably the moderating force. If you go to different like sources of money instead of going to the far left and far right
Wait,
like
so
sources
you're
of
telling
money
me
that
that in
exist
the-
right now.
Okay, like logically, in the last 30 years, the number and quantity of donations has increased. Would you contend that moderation has increased as a result of that, and to what extent?
Because what has increased is the ability of these rich donors to give more money. What hasn't changed is the requisite amount
Wait,
that
there also has definitely
needs
been
to
more
have.
donors. Wait. Are you telling me there hasn't been an increase in the
I am
number of
talking about
donors?
that break off where they
No,
decided we can't
has there
make
been more donors as well? Yes. Okay. I think I did that. Fine. I'll start with what?
Everyone ready? Let's start now. The first way you vote for us is trade. Their responses were new and second summary and really not that good. They just tell you that people around the country really don't like trade deals. That is not the same thing as being in support of non-tariff barriers to trade that arbitrarily limit competition in the market. The one evidence that we give you is crystal clear in saying that the Electoral College produces a bias that results in actual policy where the president signs with a stroke of a pen an arbitrary restriction on steel parity or something, which drives down everyone's income because when the market is less free, the people are less free economically and do less well. The Spotarino evidence makes that link very clear to people's incomes. A lot of the stuff in this round is messy. There's a lot of stuff on moderation, a lot of stuff on bases, a lot of stuff on money. But what there is not a lot of stuff on is this trade thing. The impact is crystal clear and definitely goes Just sign here, it's easy. But if you don't want to vote there, you can vote for us off of the money and politics argument, which comes before any arguments about candidates' voter bases, because their donors actually control their platforms, because they need the money in order to get the donors all of the turns that they read in rebuttal, or like the turns, they don't actually turn the argument, but all of the like cards that they said were turns that say that people that like bad donors influence bad policy are the proof that our argument is more important, because candidates actually listen to their donors. And we tell you with the Willis evidence that when you increase the requisite amount of money that a candidate absolutely needs in order to possibly be president of the United States, they have to attract new donors instead of just going back to the radical ones that they have right now, which our rock evidence indicates that they have currently. Which means even if they win that finance is bad, you can't vote for them off of this argument, because radical donations are non-unique. The only thing that is unique is that in our world you expand the donor base. Our FANG evidence is really clear in saying that in general donations lead to a deviation from a candidate's ideal policy towards the center. That matters because when you have this centrist policy, which comes as a result of most businesses ideologically preferring a stable centrist policy is better for the economy, and additionally because you have a lot of factual interests involved that check each other back, you end up with more moderation, which links into all of the stuff about actual policy change happening as a result of solving gridlock. Those are two crystal clear reasons I think you should have fun.
No. Order is trade, money, and then architecture. Yes? Everyone good? Okay, cool. Most important impact is moderation. They agree. So I don't know why trade is the most important impact, but even on trade, the two responses we make, yes, they're in second summary, but that's because they read a turn, and unless I'm obligated to respond to every turn in first or second rebuttal, which I'm not, that's fine. So the first thing is the Harvard School of Public Health. What it says is that 89% of Americans support trade restrictions that bring jobs back to the U.S., which is the same thing as the protectionism they talk about. He just tries to kind of like logic his way out of it, call the card. That's exactly what it says. And second, and this was dropped, is Needham, who tells us that the majority of people in swing states do not support no trade deals, they support new trade deals. They just want changes. So you will have tariffs for a week, then you get the new deal, and everything is good, everything is great. That's why you should prefer the Hill analysis, which says holistically that people in swing states represent what the rest of the nation wants. So if they really do want protectionism, that's just because everybody does. That takes out the argument. Then, on the argument about money, they just extend Willis telling you that when you increase the requisite amount, you need new donors. They don't actually send an internal warrant for this, just a card saying that it's true. We give you logic for why it's not true. Number one, they already have donors on board. These people are exorbitantly rich. The last time we lifted the amount of money restrictions like Citizens United, they were able to get more money from those people, like they concede. So they would just do the same and offer them more pork barrel projects for their existing special interests because candidates don't really have an incentive to diversify. Second is the boxcar telling you that special interests end up being ideologically extreme anyways. And then third, and most importantly, is what we tell you that if candidates are going to be appealing to more extreme segments of the electorate, and they would also appeal to more extreme donors because they kill two birds with one stone instead of trying to diverge in those two paths, which means we get both links. But most importantly, if we win our warrant to prefer our link to campaign platforms to links to money for a number of reasons. Number one is the Ross analysis, which says that they are moderating in the status quo, which means any risk of it getting worse is a reason to vote for us. Number two is strength of link, because candidates already have a ton of money in the system. Some marginal increase doesn't outweigh a complete reconfiguration of campaign strategy. On our second warrant, they don't respond to first the Hill, which says that these swing states are representatives. Second, we tell you from Ross again that they build broad-based moderate coalitions that pushes them to the center in the scope of the last 30 years, excluding Donald Trump. And finally, Calidero, who says that they go for base voters to break the national tie, and because they win elections on the basis of that, they adopt extreme platforms, and everything pretty much gets screwed up. Thank you.
I think there's lots of cool.